Okay, so we are picking up in Pirkei Avos, chapter 3, Mishna 4. Again, depending on how you divide them, there's different ways to divide the Mishnas in Pirkei Avos, but this is how actually it's divided in the art scroll. We know that art scroll makes all these important decisions. So the Mishnah says as follows: Rabbi Shimon Omer. Rabbi Shimon says, this is the famous Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who actually, I guess, since we're on Lad Ba'omer, the 34th day of the Omer, and Lag Ba'omer, yesterday is associated with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, whether accurately or inaccurately, but it is associated with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. That's a discussion for another time. But okay, so it works out that we're learning a teaching of Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Shimon said, "Shlosha she'achlu al shulchan echad." If 3 people ate from one table, v'lo amru alav divrei Torah, and they did not speak upon it words of Torah, ki'ilu achlu mizivchei mesim. It's as if they ate from the sacrifices of the dead, or to the dead. Shenemar, as the verse says, Kikol shulchanos malu ki tzara bli makom. For all tables are full of vomit. They combine ki tzara into one thing, filthy vomit in this translation. Sometimes it can also be 2 separate things: vomit and excrement. Bli makom, without makom. In this translation, they understand makom to refer to God, the all-present, the omnipresent. Like we have at the Seder, we say Baruch HaMakom, like we wish mourners HaMakom Yenachem Eschem. So that's what they translate here, but it's not necessarily, that it has to be translated that way. In fact, I put in the series of verses on the source sheet for those who have it from Isaiah, Yeshaya chapter 28, which this verse comes from, and the 3rd verse, verse 8, is this verse: for all tables were filled with vomit and ordure without place. So they just say without place, and we'll see in the explanations that some will understand it just to mean a simple word place and not refer to God. In any event, it quotes this verse, which refers to there's a type of table that is full of vomit and ordure, which I guess is a word for excrement, bli makom, without place, and so that Rabbi Shimon says that's talking about a table that has no Torah upon it. Aval shlosha she'achlu al shulchan echad, but 3 that sit at one table, the amru alav divrei Torah, and they did speak upon it words of Torah. Ki'ilu achlu mishulchanu shel makom barachu. It's as if they ate from the table of God. Shenemar, as the verse says, Vayidaber Elai zeh hashulchan asher lifnei Hashem. It says, and he spoke to me. This is the table that is before God. And this comes from a verse in Yechezkel, and the beginning of that verse, which I think is significant here. The beginning of that verse talks about, it's actually a prophecy that Ezekiel experienced, I think regarding the makeup of the 3rd Beis HaMikdash, 3rd temple, and what it would look like. And so there's all these descriptions of everything. So the altar, the Mizbeach, is described there, and it says that it's of wood. Actually, I have it on the bottom also. The altar was wood, 3 cubits high and 2 cubits long, and its corners and its length and its walls were wood. And then it says, and he spoke to me. So in this prophecy, God or an angel, I don't remember, speaks to Yechezkel and says, this is the table that is before the Lord. So it describes actually the altar, the Mizbeach, as a shulchan, as a table. And that's what we're referencing here. And we're saying that if 3 eat on one table, and they do have divrei Torah, they do have words of Torah, it's as if they ate from the shulchan of Hashem, the table of God, and it quotes this verse as a proof to that. Okay, so what is this Mishnah coming to teach us? Now, this Mishnah does actually, seem a little bit similar to what we learned last week, where we talked about two people that eat, or not eat, two people that sit, right? That was the two people that sit and they don't have words of Torah between them. Rabbi Chanina ben Tradion said, it's a moshav v'leitzim. It's a sitting of scoffers, but to that sitting, they do have words of Torah between them, then God's presence is there. And now Rabbi Shimon seems kind of similar, but he chooses different words and different terms to describe things. Says that three people who are eating at a table and they don't have words of Torah, that's like eating from zivchei mesim, the sacrifices to the dead. And if they do have words of Torah, then it's as if they're eating from the table of God. Okay, so let's start with the first half. And if you have the source sheet, so I included a couple of verses that precede the verse that's quoted. So looking at Yeshaya, Isaiah chapter 28, so there Yeshaya is he's prophesizing about the northern kingdom of Israel first and how they're just terrible people there and God's going to punish them. And then he turns his attention to the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, and he, also has some harsh words for them too. But
Bashar, can you repeat the Mishnah again?
The Mishnah says that if three people eat and they don't have words of Torah, it's as if they ate from a table of. It's as if they ate from the sacrifices to the dead, and if they do have words of Torah, it's as if they ate from the table of God. Now, on the first part, like it's as if they ate from zivchei mesim, from the sacrifice to the dead. It quotes this verse in Yeshaya that says, "For all tables were filled with vomit and excrement without place." But before that verse in Yeshaya, so that's verse 8 of chapter 28. Before that, it says, verse 6 says, "And for a spirit of justice to him who sits in judgment, and for might for those who bring back the war to the gate. These two erred because of wine and strayed because of strong wine. Priest and prophet erred because of strong wine. They became corrupt because of wine. They went astray because of strong wine. They erred against the seer. They caused justice to stumble." So the previous verse describes kind of sound a lot of mention of wine there, kind of a drunken feasts are being described in the previous verse. Erred because of wine, strayed because of strong wine, priest and prophet erred because of strong wine, corrupt because of wine, a lot of wine going on. And then it says, "For all tables were filled with vomit and ordure." Now it's not so surprising the table's full of vomit when there's a wine feast that's going on. So in context, that makes that seems to fit. So
what was the first Mishnah?
The first Mishnah, the previous Mishnah.
Yeah.
The previous Mishnah was similar. Was about if people are sitting and they don't have Torah between them, so then it's a sitting of scoffers. But if they do, so then God's presence is with them. But we'll come, when it's relevant, we'll bring that back in. So the Midrash Shmuel quotes first from, well, actually not first, but we're doing it out of order. But when he explains this part of the Mishnah, so one of the many sources he quotes is from the Lev Avos. Now the Lev Avos says that these feasts, that are being described, and actually before that even, this that the Mishnah is describing, three people are sitting and they have no words of Torah between them. So that that demonstrates what the function of this meal is. This meal, there's no interest in spiritual growth here, in words of Torah. They're eating just to satisfy their bodies, but they're not gathering for any spiritual purpose to feed their souls, to feed their neshamos. So the body, he says, is dead. The body is something that is not, it's not eternal. It's only temporary, and so if one's eating just to satisfy their physical need purely and just to satisfy the body, so that's as if one eats miziv chemesim, from the sacrifice to the dead, because you're sort of sacrificing to the dead. You're sacrificing to the body, which has no, which does not, is like it's dead. It's not lasting, and it brings a proof from these verses. Now, the one thing that will need to be explained, whatever we say, is why 3? Where does the number, 3 people who eat? Why 3? So he says, because the verses that precede it refer to 3 types of people. Judges, because it talks about justice, those who sit for a spirit of justice to him who sits in judgment, refers to, which I think on the simple level refers to God actually, but you have to check that out. But he's saying could refer to judges, and then it says in that verse, it talks about priest and prophet erred because of strong wine. So it talks about priest and prophet. Now, prophet here would not be a real prophet, would be a false prophet, but those who claim to be prophets in their times, and so it talks about these 3 types of sort of leaders: a judge, a priest, a prophet, Kohen, a Kohen, a Navi. He calls the judge actually a Chacham, a person of knowledge. So such people should be leading by example, should be speaking in Torah, should be educating, and but instead they're getting drunk and feasting and just feeding their bodies purely. So and it seems that that's the purpose, that it's an ending itself. The feasting is an ending itself for them, and so such people, there's no mention of God there. There's no mention of spirituality, which feeds the soul. Rather, all they have is feeding their bodies. What you're left with then, the only end to that is when it comes back out, basically. And so the verses are describing, and it's being interpreted in this Mishnah, that those who sit and all they're seeking is to feed their bodies. Well, what's the benefit of that, or what's the result of that? It's just vomit and excrement. That's all that such a meal produces. All you do is you feed your bodily needs and your bodily pleasures, and what you're left with at the end is just excrement, as opposed to one who when there's Torah and there's feeding the soul. So then there's a benefit to the benefits described as it's as if you're eating from the table of God, but there's something that results from it beyond just vomiting excrement. That's the Leiv Avos. The Abarbanel, Rabbi Yitzchak Abarbanel, quoted again by Midrash Shmuel, gets, and I apologize for the, how graphic it is, but gets pretty graphic about this vomit and excrement. And he says, these people who are feasting, they're what's being described in these verses and what Rabbi Shimon is telling us is people who are feasting in this manner and just partying away, and there's no purpose to it. There's no benefit, and there's, I mean, it's kind of also like opposites here. Like there's a feast that's for spiritual purposes, so it's not going to deteriorate into just drunkenness. When there's Torah there, when it's done based on Torah principles, so then it won't just devolve into a drunken feast. But if it does, if there's no Torah there, then it can devolve into this just drunken feast. And he reads it that you would then be. The verse says there's ki v'tzoa bli makom. There's vomit excrement without place, meaning there's nowhere for it to go. It's going to be the table will be full of these things. There will be no place to, for it to go except for on the table. Or alternatively, they won't have any room for it. They'll have eaten so much and drunken so much that it will be bli makom. There will be no place for it in their bodies anymore, and they'll need to release it. That's the verse that says that bli makom. Like as I said before, the translation that I printed on the source sheet says bli makom is without God there, but the Barbanel is just saying bli makom means without place. I mean, there will be no place to move for them, and they'll be so. Actually, just to go back, the way he says his first interpretation is they'll be so drunk and so full, and then they won't be able to move, and they'll be bli makom. They'll have no place that they can go, and so it will all end up in front of them on the table. Or alternatively, bli makom, there's no place for it. May refer to just they'll be so full, there'll be no place for what's inside of them, and that will end up on the table. Either way, pretty graphic description of what this might look like, but he's learning it, just taking it very literally, that such feasts devolve into drunkenness and end up with just a mess, basically. And as opposed to the Leiv Avos was maybe saying a little bit more than just the description, but the point, it's what the Mishna is expressing going to Leiv Avos, is that yes, we have this graphic description of this, vomit and whatever all over the place, but the point is more that that's all you have. That's all you end up with if there's nothing spiritual from the feast.
What is the spiritual part of it?
What's that?
What's the spiritual part of it?
I can't hear you.
You said there's a physical part of it and spiritual part of it.
Right. No. So I'm saying if there's no Torah, if there's no,
Right.
spiritual intention,
Right.
so then all that there is just the physical, and you end up with, just the vomit or the excrement is all that meal produces. That's
Right.
the first half.
Okay.
Okay. So moving now to the second half, though. So the second half says, but 3 that eat on a table and they do speak words of Torah. So that's as if they ate from the table of God. And it quotes this verse in Yechezkel and Ezekiel. So actually, before I get into what the Midrash Shmuel says, I want to just get into a little bit of the background here, because this Mishnah is just one example of numerous associations that we have with our tables being like a table of God, which is often associated with the Mizbeach, the altar. So there's the Gemara, the Talmud, in a number of places says the following, but we'll quote the Gemara in Brachos. The Gemara says in Brachos that there are 3 things that extend a person's life. And actually, the Gemara does not quote some of the straight up verses in the Torah that mention things that could lengthen one's life, like honoring parents or the mitzvah of sending away the mother bird. But the Gemara actually quotes three other things, and one of those is Hama'arich al shulchano, somebody who takes a long time at their table. You have long meals. The Gemara says if you have long meals, your life will be lengthened. Okay, why? So it elaborates, and it says the reason is, this is in Brachos Daf Nun Daled, 54a onto 54b. It says because a poor person may come, and you'll be able to give him food. And then it quotes the same verse that our Mishnah quotes. It says that the Mizbeach, the altar, was of wood, etc. And then the end of the verse says, and God spoke to me and said, this is the table before God. So the beginning of the verse calls it a Mizbeach, an altar. The end of the verse calls it a table. So which one is it? Is it an altar or is it a table? So what it seems to be indicating to us is that a table can be like an altar, can be like a mizbeach. And the Gemara says that Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Lazar taught that while the temple is standing, so the mizbeach, the altar, brings kapara, brings atonement for Israel. But now it's a person's table that brings kapara, that brings atonement. Our tables are what bring atonement. And it seems to be associated with the idea of giving food to the poor. And what it seems to be saying is that, while your food is still out, that's when a poor person knocks, they need a meal, so you have the food out. So if you lengthen your meal and you leave the food out, and it's still available, so then that's a good thing. And that can bring atonement because you'll use it to feed the poor. That's what the Gemara seems to be saying. That's how Rashi learns it, that a person's table brings atonement by using it to feed the poor and feed guests. But there's another approach to this, which I found very fascinating, which is a comment of the Maharsha. The Maharsha is one of the classic commentators on the Talmud, but specifically also on Agada, so on the stories and the lessons of the Gemara. And so the Maharsha poses a few questions. He says, well, first of all, why? Why does a person's table bring atonement instead of the mizbeach? I guess what's the connection between one's table and the mizbeach and the altar? And another question that he poses, among others, is what does it mean? Why does it say to lengthen your table? Literally, the language the Talmud uses is hama'arich al shulchano, one who extends at their table. It doesn't say one who extends their meal. It says one who extends on their table. So what's the implication? Why does it say it that way? So he suggests that and he's commenting in the context of a different passage that talks about leaving something over to remember the destruction of the temple. In many contexts, there's many things one kind of leaves to remember the destruction. There's an opinion expressed there, I think, to leave over some food, kind of as to remember the destruction. But in that context, to relate it to our discussion, the Maharsha says that when a person leaves something over, so that's like a carbon. That's like they're bringing something bringing an offering, because they're giving up something from themselves. They're saying, I'm withholding. I'm not going to finish that, whatever it is that looks really good, right? So they're withholding. They're leaving something over. That's like bringing an offering, and he says, now you might say that you could have interpreted that to mean, well, you should just have smaller meals, right? Don't make as much food in the first place. So, But if you do that, then you won't be able to give the poor when they come. So he says, no. So what it's telling you is, no, you should have the food there, and you just don't eat it. Have it available so you could give it to the poor, and just don't eat from it. And he says that's the idea of ma'arich al shulchano. That's why the Talmud says you extend your table. You don't extend what you eat. You don't eat more, but you extend your table. You have the food there, and you make a lot of food. You prepare a lot of food, but not for yourself. You prepare it for others. You hold back. You hold back, but you still make sure that there's food available to share with the poor. So that's that's how he understands, and that's what makes it similar to the mizbeach, to the altar, and that's what so it's like you're bringing an offering, and it brings atonement, but you don't lose out for bringing to the poor. But what's different about this approach than the other approach is the first approach is that, like Rashi, and the simple reading of the Gemara there is that what actually brings the atonement is that you use it for the poor. That's what brings the atonement. That's our tables are like a mizbeach, they're like an altar because we give from them to the poor, and that makes them like an altar. The Maharsha is saying no, it's not. It's that we give to the poor, and that's important, and that's why we have to have plenty of food there. But what actually is what makes it like a mizbeach, what makes it like an altar, is giving up some of it from that we're not gonna partake of, and leaving it to the side. Now that we end up giving that to the poor, and that's great. But it's really the withholding that's the offering. Robert.
I was just thinking that there was supposed to always be something burning on the mizbeach. So maybe similarly, we could say you should always have food on your table available for the poor.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so that's one comparison, one context where we describe our tables like a mizbeach, as like an altar. And the truth is that this manifests itself in a number of practices that we have. So to name a few, so one is that we are supposed to have salt on our table. And that is because every carbon, every offering always had salt along with it. And since our table is like a mizbeach, so we're supposed to have salt on the table. Another is there's a custom to cover or to remove knives from the table, at least before benching, before Birkas Hamazon. And that also, there's different explanations for it. But one explanation is because there was no iron in the preparation on the mizbeach and in creating the mizbeach, creating the altar. So we kind of remove the knives because the table is like a mizbeach. According to that, why don't we should never have knives on the table, not just at the time of benching, but okay. Some explain the idea of when we make a kiddush or any kosher bracha, any cup cup of wine and we make a blessing over, it's supposed to be full. The loaves that we make blessings over, should be full. Certainly for Shabbos and holidays. Even during the week, if you have a choice, it's better if you have a full one, on the table. It's better to make and you're going to eat from there. It's better to make the blessing on the full one rather than on a whole roll rather than on a half a roll. But the idea of using what we call, shleimim, things that are full, also, according to some commentators, relates to how the mizbeach was built with complete stones. Without, I guess, chips in them or whatever it might be. And finally, there's an idea which doesn't really have a clear source, but it's often quoted, which is that a person's not supposed to sit or stand on a table. And although it's not well sourced, it seems that the idea behind it is, and the way that people say it is, because the table is like a mizbeach, it's like an altar. You don't sit or stand on a table. Some say it's only when there's food on it. Other times you're allowed to. Okay, different discussion, but there's not so much base, not so much to go on. Yes, Robert.
But the Kohanim did walk on the edge of
They
it.
did walk, but they had a special path to walk on. I don't know if they
Okay.
walked on the center itself. So if you build your table
Or shep-
with a thing to walk, so then go for it. Then you'll really be like a mizbeach. Yes.
or shep- What's the Mishnah again?
What's that?
What's the Mishnah again?
Well, we'll come back to when we're ready. Okay. Okay, so that's so that those are a number of ideas just in general of relating our tables to a mizbeach. And now, right, so it's now going back to the Mishnah. So then our Mishnah says that if three people eat on one table and they do speak words of Torah, it's as if they ate from the table of God. And it quotes the same verse. It's the same verse that the passage in Brachos that I mentioned is using the same verse for us, that it describes the Mizbeach, the altar, as a Mizbeach, and then in the same verse it describes it as a shulchan, as a table. So it seems a table can be like a Mizbeach. So actually, before we come to the Midrash Shmuel, just one comment I saw in the Tiferes Yisrael by Rabbi Yisrael Lipschitz. So he says that one second. Yeah, he mentions he sources another thing, which is a Gemara, a passage in Sukkah, Mem Tes on the base 49b of Sukkah, where it says, if you want to bring a wine libation on the Mizbeach, which was part of the offerings, but we don't have that anymore. We don't have offerings. So you want to bring a wine libation, it says you should fill the mouth of a Torah scholar with wine. I don't think it means to get him drunk. I think it just means to provide for him. So because the Torah scholar is like sanctified like a Mizbeach, and so instead of libating onto the Mizbeach, you can do the libation into the Torah scholar's mouth. Probably not directly, but indirectly. So he says that's also a context where we have this idea where Torah and karbanos and offerings kind of meet, and you can bring an offering through creating Torah. Basically, that's the context over there. Okay, so now coming back to us. So our Mishnah says that three people who eat on one table and they speak words of Torah, it's as if they ate from the table of Hashem. So there's two ways, very similar, very subtly different, that the Midrash Shmuel explains these words. Number one is he quotes this statement that we mentioned before, that nowadays that we don't have a temple and we don't have a mizbeach, so then it's our tables that bring atonement. But this Mishnah would be taking a bit of a different spin. Up to now, we talked about the atonement coming as a result of feeding the poor, or according to the Marsha, maybe leaving over some food. Here, our Mishnah is saying the atonement, or the way he's explaining our Mishnah, comes from speaking words of Torah at the table. In order to turn our table into a mizbeach, into an altar, we speak words of Torah, and that makes the table into an altar. And if we don't, though, then it does not turn our table into an altar, and that's what we spoke about before. The other way that he says it, again, it's very subtly, but it's very similar, but maybe subtly different. That is that if people speak in words of Torah, then it's as if they brought karbanos, as if they brought offerings, and the food that they eat is now like eating from the offerings. So what this means is that we think maybe sometimes we think of offerings as like, they took the animal, sacrificed, put it on the mizbeach and on the altar, and then it burned up, and that was it, right? Which was true for certain types of offerings, but many types of offerings were not that way at all. There were very limited parts that went on the altar. The rest was either eaten by the Kohanim, by the priests for certain types of offerings, like sin offerings. But then there were offerings like shlamim, like peace offerings, where actually most of it was consumed by the people, the people who were bringing the offering. Even a Yisrael, even a non-Kohen, you didn't have to be a priest. You got to eat your offering. And there were parts that were eaten by the Kohanim still, but by the priests, but people got to eat from the offering. So, and that's, certainly a very, lofty experience where you have an offering. Part of it goes to God on the Mizbeach, on the altar. Part of it gets consumed. We get to consume. And but nowadays we don't have that. But we have food and we have tables. And by what we have to do though is turn our table into a mizbeach. We have to turn our table first we have to turn our table into a mizbeach, and then the food that we can eat is as if we're eating from that offering. And we do so according to this teaching. We turn our table into a mizbeach, into an altar, by speaking words of Torah at the table, and then the food that we consume becomes like food from an offering. Yeah, so let's close though with a thought that expounds on this that I saw. It's actually quoted in the Art Scroll from Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, which is kind of gives even it takes this to a little bit of a deeper level. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky points out that although I mentioned just now that a carbon, many of the offerings do get eaten, Rabbi Yaakov points out that is only for a Jew who's bringing a offering. But when a non-Jew brings an offering, well, although we accept in the Beis Hamikdash, in the temple, they accepted offerings from non-Jews, but the non-Jew did not get to consume from that offering, and it all went on the mizbeach, it all went on the altar. And Rav Yaakov says that spoke to a fundamental difference in Jewish philosophy and that of other religions, and especially of idol worshippers. And he says that other philosophies, other religions, so they consider a person to mostly be a physical being who can reach a degree of spirituality when involved in religious activities. So prayer or some other types of rituals, but they don't view the body and spirit as coexisting to the same degree that we view it. And that's why as I mentioned, that's why the Talmud says that when an idolater brings an offering in our temple, well, we let them bring an offering to our God in our temple, but we do not, but the none of it gets eaten by the person. None of it even gets eaten by a Kohen. The entire offering is brought, and the language that the Gemara uses, the Talmud in Menachos 73b, the Gemara says is because the idolater intends his offering only for heaven, meaning there's no part that relates to me at all. So a religious activity for him is purely religious and doesn't really relate to the person. And And the way he says it here is an idolater cannot fathom conceptually that a mortal human being can engage in the physical act of eating and thereby elicit forgiveness for the owner of the offering. Meaning what my eating cannot have anything to do with this offering. It can't, the offering is the offering before God. It's a religious activity, but my physical eating cannot have anything to do with eliciting forgiveness. But Judaism views the matter in exactly the opposite way. Not only is physical existence impossible without the satisfaction of spiritual needs, but spirituality must be realized through physical vehicles. The enactment of spiritual principles must assume concrete forms. Man is a physical being elevated by the soul God blew into him. For this reason, offerings brought in the temple must be eaten by the Kohanim and the owners of the offering. Man achieves spiritual fulfillment by sanctifying the mundane. So it's not just that you could eat them. Atonement from the offering can only be achieved if it was eaten, at least certainly for if the part that goes to the Kohanim was eaten. The priests had to eat their portion, and that was part of the process to achieve atonement. And that's because what it's really teaching us is that the spiritual and the ritual activities, they don't exist in their own world, in their own realm, and have not, don't relate to the physical and daily life of an individual. No, they directly relate. Our Mishnah, he says, emphasizes this difference of approach. One who engages in the physical act of eating without introducing a spiritual element into his meals establishes a demarcation between the physical and spiritual domains. In effect, he is declaring that they share no interaction. His meal is therefore the equivalent of an offering brought to an idol. If there's no spiritual element to a person's meal, so they're kind of saying they're creating this demarcation. There's my physical life and there's my spiritual life, and they have no relationship with each other. But people who follow the Torah by giving physical garb to spiritual concepts and by elevating the physical with an infusion of spirituality, eat from God's table, their meals reflect the Jewish view as expressed in the laws of offerings. That when we do mix Torah with our meal, so then what we're mixing these two things, which we're saying go together, which in the Jewish outlook, we're mixing together the concept of that the spiritual is very much related and intertwined with the physical, and a physical meal should have a spiritual component to it, and that's expressed in the way we bring our offerings, that they have the spiritual component to God and the physical component to us, but they're intertwined, they go together, and the atonement is achieved through both together. And the same is true at a meal. We don't want to demarcate and separate and say, no, this is our physical life, this is my eating, and this is my ritual is done separately. No, all of it is intertwined, and at a meal should have both to make that clear. And if one does that, that's what the Mishnah says. It's ki'ilu achal mishulchan shamakom. Now it's like I'm eating from the table of God. It's like I'm eating from the altar. It's very similar to what goes on when one brings a carbon. Okay.
Very interesting. Thank you, Rabbi Yashikov.
You're welcome.
Rabbi.